How can a 7-times world champion be smiling and confident after being out of Q3 in the Grand Prix for Ferrari? What does Hamilton know that the rest of the paddock seems not to see? Emilia Romagna 2025 was emerged as an emblematic date in the Formula One calendar, not only because of its historical location in the Imola layout, but for the emotional burden it brought with it. Lewis Hamilton's debut as Ferrari pilot in Italian territory. An image that for years was considered utopian, finally materialized in front of the Tifosi. However, what should be a celebration ended up becoming an almost traumatic episode for Maranello's team. From Friday's free training, there were contradictory signs. Hamilton showed flashes of improvement in the first session, especially in the behavior of the car in braking and in the stability in medium curves, one of the main weaknesses of the SF-25 so far this season. Even within the garage, the atmosphere seemed slightly more optimistic than in previous quotes. There was talk of a possible step forward in the general setup, focused on more progressive suspension and braking distribution. But that apparent progress evaporated as soon as the classification began. The Q1 passed without great shocks, but in Q2 the real drama emerged. With both cars on the track, Ferrari made the decision to go out in 2 batches, as the top teams usually do. First a return with a tire used to establish a reference, and then the final attack with a new set. In that second attempt, when everything should align for the jump to Q3, something failed. Hamilton, who in the first timed round had shown decent rhythm, completely lost the grip when setting up the second game of tires. The car became unstable, unable to generate traction or sufficient support in the key points of the circuit such as minorale or high variant. There were no visible pilot errors. There was no traffic. There were no adverse conditions. It was simply a car that suddenly did not work. At that moment, all the work of the weekend collapsed. Charles Leclerc, on the other hand, was also out of Q3 in similar conditions. Both Ferrari were eliminated from the classification between positions 11 and 12. But the emotional blow was particularly stronger in Hamilton, which lived for the first time the contrast between the glory expected by Italian fans and the harsh reality of a car still without a clear direction. The most worrying thing for technicians was the impossibility of predicting that performance fall. Neither the simulator data nor the career simulations anticipated such a radical change in the car response to a simple tire change. And that not only frustrates the pilot. Brake confidence. The team steals the ability to build a coherent strategy. After getting out of SF-25, Hamilton was clear and visceral in his statements. He said devastated. He said he was betrayed by the car because during the weekend the sensations had improved. But above all, he stressed something key. The balance of the car and the brakes were better, and that made him think they were close to something. That is Imola's paradox. Ferrari's worst qualifying result in his house in years, but also, perhaps, a technical turning point that reveals subtle signals of progress. The situation that Lewis Hamilton lives with the SF-25 goes beyond a matter of adaptation or lack of chemistry with a new car. What has evidenced the Imola Grand Prix, and especially the frustrating classification session, is the existence of a structural problem in the car. A deep mechanical inconsistency that prevents any stable confidence construction. And that inconsistency has a name and surname, the brake system. To understand what Hamilton is facing, we must bear in mind that the British pilot has worked for more than a decade with the same brake provider. Carbon Industry, which Mercedes used. Your deep braking driving style, precise modulations and instantaneous weight transfer is molded by the sensitivity that system provided. Now, when passing to Ferrari, you meet a different supplier, Brembo, whose components react differently at temperature, pressure, and durability. But the real problem lies in the brand, but in the lack of consistency from one game to another. During the weekend in Imola, Hamilton was explicit in his diagnosis. It is not that the brake is worse or better. It is unpredictable. In the first free training session, the car responded well. The pedal feedback was progressive, the bite was balanced, and the control in the braking was superior to what he had experienced in the previous appointments. Everything pointed to a technical step forward, especially in a path like Imola, where the yield in braking defines both the passage through curve and the ability to prepare the overtaking. But when the team mounted another brake set for the second session, the story was completely different. The pedal became more spongy, the answer changed in the middle of the long batches, and the data showed an inconsistent performance between the front and rear axle. The direct consequence of this is devastating for an elite pilot. If you cannot trust that the car will do the same in each curve, you cannot push. If you can't push, you can't extract time. And if you can't extract time, your weekend is convicted. In the classification, this technical lottery became a capital problem. Hamilton felt that the car behaved differently between one batch and another just by changing the brakes, and this ruined any possibility of improving its time. The performance in Imola was not just low, it was incoherent. And that, for a pilot of his caliber, is intolerable. The Ferrari team, meanwhile, has partially recognized the situation, although it has not yet offered a definitive solution. There are indications that they are working to adjust the thermal parameters and review the variability between component production lots. But in a category like Formula One, where everything is measured in thousands, that uncertainty is not a minor inconvenience. It is a poison that is filtered in each curve, in each round thrown, in each classification attempt. Hamilton has been sharp about it. It is not the transition between systems that costs him. It is the randomness of behavior, not knowing what to expect. And that lack of predictability is what prevents building a solid base for the rest of the technical work. Every weekend starts from scratch. And that, in such a competitive championship, is a luxury that cannot be allowed. In spite of everything, and this is key, the British has not lost faith. He stressed that positive sensations at certain times of the weekend are signs that there is a correct address, although it is still far from being constant. He is convinced that if they manage to stabilize that performance, if they can convert that roller roulette of sensations into a straight line of progress, Ferrari will have what to fight. And in that lies its optimism, not in what today is the car, but in what it can become. After a classification that marked a new minimum in Ferrari's recent history in Imola, and facing mechanical problems that undermine any pilot's trust, the logical thing would be to expect frustration, resignation, or even a public criticism of the team. But what surprises Lewis Hamilton is that, even in the middle of the disaster, he remains firm in his discourse of optimism. And it is not a naive optimism. It is one built from experience, from the understanding of the technical process, and from a long-term strategic vision. But also, perhaps, a pinch of emotional necessity to justify one of the boldest decisions of his career. Hamilton is not a pilot who leaves surface emotions. He has been in the Formula One elite for more than 15 years, and has lived complete cycles of domain, fall, and reconstruction. Know perfectly what it means to be in a team that does not respond. He lived in McLaren between 2009 and 2012, and then transformed it into a glory cycle with Mercedes. That same redemption narrative is what now seems to be beginning in Ferrari. But unlike other moments of his career, this time there is a stronger emotional factor: the weight of the legacy. From the moment he signed with Ferrari, Hamilton knew that this stage would not be just a matter of results. Being Ferrari pilot is a symbolic issue. It is belonging to the most mythical history of motoring. And that is why his speech after the debacle in Imola does not point to excuses, but to the reaffirmation of a promise: to turn Ferrari into a winning team again. When he says he sees progress, he does not only refer to Chronos. It refers to internal dynamics, communication with engineers, to improvements in data management, a car that, although it still does not respond at all, begins to broadcast signs of life. This type of strategic optimism also works as a shield. It protects the team from media pressure, from fierce criticism that usually falls strongly on Ferrari when the results do not accompany. Hamilton has chosen to put themselves in charge of the project not only as a pilot, but as a political figure within the team. By stating that he sees improvements, that the brakes worked better in certain sessions, that the balance was decent during the practices, what he really is doing is to sustain the morale of his surroundings. He knows that for SF-25 evolving, he needs internal cohesion, and that begins with speech. Now, this optimism can also be interpreted as a subtle warning form. When a pilot like Hamilton speaks of progress, he does it with the expectation that this progress materializes soon. He knows the technical development times and knows that Formula One does not expect. If there is no tangible improvement in the next races, the narrative could change. And that same optimism, today constructive, could become public pressure towards Maranello. The key is to understand that for Hamilton, what happened in Imola does not represent a sentence. It is a blurred photograph of a process that just begins. The British has made it clear that he has not yet been able to configure the car to his liking. That barely begins to modify aspects of driving and tuning that in Mercedes already had automated. But within that difficulty, it has also found a stimulating challenge: to build again from scratch. Redefine your style based on a new environment. And that, for a competitor of his caliber, can be more motivating than any pole position. This is the core of your optimism. He does not deny the problems. He recognizes them, verbalizes them, but also frames them within a path of evolution. The message he launches is not only towards fans or media. It is inside the team. It is a way of saying, we are still far away, but there is a way. And as long as there is a way, there is possibility. And as long as there is a possibility, Hamilton will not release the steering wheel. The conclusion of the Hamilton case in Imola is not defined by the cold results of the stopwatch, but by the story that begins to be built between the lines. This is not simply another disappointing chapter in Ferrari's long history in his fight to return to the top. It is the beginning of a narrative that could, if the technical and human factors are aligned, to become one of the most shocking transformations of the modern era of Formula One. Ferrari has been chasing a rebirth for more than a decade that always stays halfway. Since Alonso's time, passing through Vettel and now with Leclerc, there have been flashes but never continuity. Hamilton represents, in this cycle, something different. A figure that does not build but to rebuild. That does not adapt to the project, but to direct it with your experience. His arrival to Ferrari is both a sports movement and a psychological operation. It is the attempt to provide the team with an internal leadership that is not limited to the technical, but encompasses the strategic, the media, and the symbolic. And for that, the optimism that he maintains, even in a context as adverse as Imola's, charges a special value. It is not an act of naivety. It is an act of purpose. Hamilton is using each interview, each statement, and each track session not only to pilot, but to redefine what it means to be Ferrari in 2025. It is building narrative, shielding the team from within and from outside, and preparing the land for a jump that, for now, only intuits the details. However, time is not a passive ally in this sport. Formula One punishes slowness. The points table has no patience with good intentions. Therefore, although his current speech is of patience and trust, he is also loaded with implicit expectation. Hamilton will not wait indefinitely. Ferrari's environment either. The tifosi, historically demanding, are already beginning to look at the calendar with anxiety. And that means that what is now seen as a stage of adaptation should soon be transformed into tangible results. The key will be on how Ferrari responds in the following appointments. In itself, it manages to stabilize its technical package. If the brake lottery solves, it improves the correlation between simulator and track, and refines its classification strategy. If those pieces fit, Hamilton will have the ideal stage to start his rise.